This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Are you ready to sink your teeth into the dark, seductive world of vampires? If so, listen to the Vampire Videos podcast, hosted by me, Dan Owen.
And me, Hugh McStay. We're exploring a century of blood-sucking cinema, from the iconic Count Dracula and chilling Nosferatu to the sparkling Edward Cullen and the brooding vampire Lestat.
Every week, we're joined by passionate fans and experts sharing their insights and unravelling the enduring appeal of these mythical creatures.
Whether you're a casual viewer or die-hard horror enthusiast, we've got something for everyone. From classic chills to modern masterpieces, we're exploring every dark corner of vampires on film and television, one bite at a time.
So grab your crucifix and cloves of garlic, settle in, and join us on this bloodthirsty journey. Vampire Videos is also part of the Film Stories podcast network.
Fantastic fun awaits, so subscribe now.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. And welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and a film critic and a filmmaker, actually. I'm working on a film at the moment. I'll talk about that later at some point. But today I am over the moon to be joined by a regular returnee of the pod, and he is a particularly close friend of the podcast because he was my first ever guest in the inaugural episode of Writers on Film. Tom Shone, thank you for returning.
That's true. It's well, it was the first one. That's been, how long has it been going now?
This is something around the 260th episode, and so it's been about 3 or 4 years now.
Wow, congrats.
Yeah, and it's gone from strength to strength. Here you were at the beginning, here you are again.
Hopefully not the end.
No, absolutely not. No, absolutely. Oh, but if it ever does end, we will have to we will fold pages and have you on as the last ever guest, just like Mark Maron with Barack Obama.
Oh yeah, well, no, yeah, just the audience killer though. Just sort of really lay it flat.
We were talking about Christopher Nolan back then, and now we're talking about Paul Greengrass, another British director. I know Nolan's a sort of mid-Atlantic. We will claim him for Britain, even though his upbringing was a little bit hither and yon. Mm-hmm. But Paul Greengrass, a British filmmaker, someone who to some degree has certain similarities, I think, with Nolan. Did you feel that going in, or what was your feeling?
I definitely felt that it was part of my kind of continued interest in British directors who have gone into, headed into the center of the franchise machine and emerged not only intact, but, with a style and with a sensibility that they can call their own. And my admiration for that feat. So in that sense, yes, it was very much a continuation of that. But at the same time, they couldn't be more different temperamentally. Hearing different solutions to the same, problems. Nolan being kind of essentially a lot more ordered and controlled about it, if I'm going to, just summarize. And Paul being much more at home in chaos, in the midst of seeming chaos, trying to forge a way forward between sort of raging, sort of opposite forces. I mean, that's how I kind of see him, is sort of in the middle of a big rugby scrum of conflicting intentions and agendas. Somehow, finding the path forward, a little bit like a footballer spotting a few yards of grass ahead of them and just sort of plunging into it. So, they're definitely, very, very different, fish, but, they've sort of essentially done the same thing. And, I kind of also see, to some extent, you can the Bourne movies, I think, were kind of so influential. You can sort of see them in some of Nolan's filmmaking, I think. Certainly kind of some of the editing and the action sequences that come through in the Dark Knight movies, and also actually in Inception. There's a race through, is it Mombasa? And I think
Yes.
these incredibly narrow alleyways and rooftops of Mombasa in Inception, that, to my eye at least, owes a little bit to sort of similar sequences in the Bourne Ultimatum, with kind of Bourne flying down alleys and across rooftops. But yeah, certainly, both filmmakers incredibly influential. I mean, in a way, probably Paul's films more so. He's almost more copyable, if that makes any sense.
Mm.
Nolan's a little bit kind of like, well, how do you turn that into a kind of, how do you copy that exactly? How do you follow that? So it's rather hard. But with sort of Paul's work, I think there was sort of more that you could directly filch, so you just see his techniques popping up all over the place.
He's kind of the greatest James Bond contributor who never made a James Bond film.
Nolan or Greengrass?
Well, there's an argument for both, but I would say Greengrass.
Oh yeah, well, definitely. I think kind of he sort of showed the way for Bond to kind of get back on its feet. And I think they were at the end of the Pierce Brosnan era, weren't they, when Bourne came along, and Pierce Brosnan it was reaching that kind of nadir of like bad CGI Bond.
Mm.
And the whole thing just sort of seemed incredibly sort of chintzy and like a fake Rolex. It was just sort of cheap and, rather silly. Not cheap financially, but and then sort of Bourne comes along, without any kind of gadgets or gizmos, having to kind of outwit the entire sort of national defense network of the United States, just using his kind of wits and a thumb drive.
Yeah, and a biro
you know,
pen.
yeah, a biro pen or a book or whatever he finds to hand. And there was like that asymmetry, was incredibly of the moment. Like uh it really it really kind of chimed, I think, with the era of the internet. It sort of spoke to that sort of generation that kind of wanted to be off the grid. I mean, he was this sort of original sort of nomad figure, born and sort of in sort of exile. So yeah, I felt like kind of Bond. It sort of was a kick up the pants really for the Bond franchise. And then when they got Daniel Craig, I mean, I think Casino Royale, it definitely owes something to the Bourne movies, not least the fact that the the love interest, which is serious, and heartfelt. It's not just a sort of typical Bond girl that Eva Green plays. Meets that kind of watery death, yeah, just like Marie does in the beginning of the Bourne Supremacy, and sort of sets the hero on the path to, essentially vengeance. So there's this kind of very visceral, direct psychological thing propelling Bond forward, as it was for, Bourne. So yeah, I think they definitely learned something from the sort of Bourne movies, and how to get kind of a little bit more down and dirty with that character.
There's also, I always also think that there's a fantasy element to Amnesia. I think we all, it's a way as a viewer that you latch on to a character if you don't remember anything that's happened before the film either, because you've just walked in and the character doesn't, and so you're really with them. You're discovering things at the same time as them, and you're like in Memento as well. You're participating in the mystery in a way which is much more intimate, and also, and this sounds a bit facetious, but I think it's kind of true. You get to be a well-trained CIA assassin without ever having to do any press-ups or having to actually be, volunteer, and of course that is later that becomes kind of the story of Bourne, is
Yeah.
him discovering that he did do press ups and he did volunteer. But especially in those first two films, you have that sort of a little bit of a sort of moral carte blanche,
Yeah.
even though, yeah, you have the skills without necessarily having to have done anything to acquire them.
Definitely, and that's reminding me of just how sort of thrilling it is. I think particularly in the first one, actually, the one that Paul didn't do, the Bourne Identity, when Bourne first discovers that he has kind of lethal skills. I think there's an incident with two policemen near a park bench that he just sort of disarms within a few seconds, and then he sort of realizes that he speaks more languages than that he knew possible. There's something there's something very kind of appealing about that. Somebody who doesn't know their own strength, and has to kind of is awoken really to their own lethal force and the guilt. I mean, to me, it's very like, I think it was very much American. That was America's sort of journey. I think that's why kind of it echoed so well. It just that was almost kind of, that's how most Americans feel about themselves. You know, they see themselves as basically peaceful, and they're shocked to find that their foreign policy, has, such kind of lethal, that it packs such lethal force, and they kind of feel there's a slight disconnect from it. And it doesn't really, sometimes it will hit through, and they'll be horrified, actually. I mean, that's been the story, it seems, certainly of Vietnam and then Iraq. There was a sort of sense of like horror that amongst, many Americans anyway, that they were capable of that. They didn't see themselves like that. And so I think that's kind of where Bourne comes in. He just absolutely captures that being in slight denial about, how lethal you are.
There's almost a sense that in Trump's America now, that is coming home as well. That, when you have the militia and ICE on the streets, they're basically treating American citizens the way they treated, the inhabitants of Baghdad or Iraqi or Kabul, Afghanistan, or wherever they happened to be the last 20 years during the war on terror. It's pretty much the same dynamic, but turned on itself.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, there's no room now for Bourne's kind of forgetfulness. Like, it's explicit, like there's no denial in place. It's just simply there on the streets. There's less of a lag, which may be one reason why. I mean, I definitely think of like, those Bourne movies as being very redolent of like a certain era in American history. I mean, which is Bush's. I feel like the noughties, Bush's America is basically the one that's kind of being laid bare in those movies. I think because, America was kind of coming to terms with its own lethal force and the sort of pushback that was getting. When Obama comes along, it doesn't seem, Bourne doesn't really belong in the realm of Obama. As the sort of fourth film, Jason Bourne sort of showed us, there was no need for him to be in the shadows almost. So for that reason. And then I would say that with Trump too, I say there's another different challenge there. If somebody were to do a Bourne movie now in the sort of Trump era, it would be simply that, the lethal force he sort of packs is no longer some secret. It's just right up front, so it's like what void discovery is there left? It's right there on TV, which isn't to say that they won't try. I think there are plans for another Bourne movie. But I don't think it'll be with, with Paul or with Matt Damon.
Well, let's go back a little bit, because obviously the Bourne movies came not very, but quite late on in Paul's career. What was your relationship with Paul Greengrass in terms of as a subject, someone you felt, okay, I really want to do a book about this guy, and also in terms of, you obviously have access to him, you interview him for the book. What was it like on a personal level?
Yeah, well, it's strange. I mean, because I hadn't met him or spoken to him before, never interviewed him before, and I approached him cold, just through his publicist. So it's like there was nothing to kind of warm up the approach, if you know what I mean. But it turns out because Paul used to be a journalist before he was a filmmaker, TV journalist. We had a lot of people in common, so we turned out to have a lot of, fairly good friends in common. And to the extent that it almost felt that we could or should have known each other before we did for the purposes of the book. But that's as it were, it made it all the more pleasant, for me, because he sort of seemed so cut from the same cloth as people that I, already know. And he's a very unpretentious man, and so very straightforward, and is very sort of proud of the work that he did when he was at Granada TV.
But he did He was on World in Action at Granada, which has one of the best theme tunes. If you've never heard the theme tune, listen to Matt Berry's cover of it on YouTube or wherever you find Spotify, wherever, and it's absolutely a stonking theme tune. But World in Action was sort of a documentary series of and some classic sort of investigative journalism took place.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a feature of my childhood, as I remember that theme tune playing, and it always seemed to take you into, I mean, I didn't realize this at the time. It was only speaking to him afterwards that I realized what was kind of innovative about it. But it was kind of the only magazine news show on TV that didn't have talking heads, that it was entirely filmed verite style, on celluloid film, embedded in a particular situation or location. So none of it was in the studio. It was all from sort of heading out into the world and just pointing a camera at people or things and trying to get the story. So I mean, that kind of gave it this kind of immediacy that Newsnight or Panorama just didn't have. I mean, there was narration, sure, but you were very much more kind of out in the world, and that was all because they were sort of taking advantage of these sort of new lighter handheld cameras that could shoot film that you were seeing in other parts of the world, behind a lot of the sort of documentary revolutions that were sort of going on in the 60s and 70s, and with sort of other filmmakers, whether it's the Maisels in America or direct cinema in Canada. So everybody was kind of basically getting their hands on these sort of new cameras and finding out that it liberated them and they could head out and record the world as it unfolded. And so Paul was sort of part of that generation. And I definitely remember some of the shows that he did. I remember the interview with the hunger striker. He got inside the Maze prison in Northern Ireland to interview, one of the hunger strikers, Raymond McCartney, and that I remember being quite sort of shocked, by that, just the access, how on earth he'd managed to do it. But I kind of wasn't aware at the time, and nor would he have been, that this was sort of prep for a film career. That wasn't how you shot movies at that point. I mean, certainly the French New Wave and so on had documentary influence in them, but it certainly wasn't how you shot British movies or kind of mainstream American movies. But it was very much, I think, the training for him for that style that he kind of arrived at when he started making films, much copied that kind of run and gun camera, all over the place, editing really fast. You're almost covering, watching like a live event unfold. The camera is there kind of ducking the bullets in a sense.
Yeah,
So
you're sort of immersed in a world which is there, and you're just capturing it rather than
yeah,
I mean, I rewatched the Bourne films, the two Bourne films, the Supremacy and Ultimatum, and I'm going to go on and watch the third one he directed, Jason Bourne, just for pure pleasure, because it's been fun revisiting them after all this time. It's a some of it is pure adrenaline, and it was funny how watching them after so much time has passed, how those original criticisms of shaky cam seem a little bit quaint, because
yeah.
they're kind of don't, they're obviously, innovative of that, but I mean, I don't know if it's because I'm rewatching, so I'm not necessarily looking for clues as to what's going to happen next. They don't seem that shaky or that difficult to follow.
I mean, I think partly that vocabulary has been sort of picked up by other people and taken even further. So in fact, they seem, and the other thing is he's very good on kind of spatial awareness and sort of situating everybody. I mean, he's a big fan of Spielberg and the way that Spielberg does that in sequences where, the geography of it, where everyone is very, very clearly laid out. And even if you look at some of the chase sequences in Bourne or in Captain Phillips and so on, and you realize he's making sure he's giving you he's covering all the bases in terms of everyone's relationship spatially. It seems more chaotic than it is. You're still engaged in kind of cognitive work, and you are being told all that you need to know. And it's easy to miss that, I think, when you first see them, because it is a sort of rather blistering kind of assault of edits and cuts and so on. But I honestly think that if he hadn't been doing that, we wouldn't be talking about him now, because it would just be sort of Michael Bay, frenzy. And you never get that sense from him that it's just frenzy.
I
But I
believe
think,
I believe they call it Bayhem.
yeah, very good. Yeah, exactly. Um, And so yeah, I think it's sort of it's definitely. I mean, those films. I think particularly the Bourne Supremacy and Bourne Ultimatum. You sort of was mentioning, kind of going back to them. I definitely feel like they've aged really, really well. Like I never come across them, and you know, I'm not sucked into them, and they do seem, as far as one can tell, at this sort of relatively close distance still, to have become kind of bedded down as as sort of classic films. They really do sort of stand up, very well, which is kind of remarkable, really, given the way that they made them. It's very chaotic.
Yeah, let's get back to that in a minute, because it's my fault for jumping forward. But he goes from World in Action to this amazing. This I never knew, the whole involvement that he had in the Peter Wright Spycatcher episode, and
Yeah,
he actually wrote Spycatcher, which I remember going on for ages. I watched this on the TV as a kid and was absolutely enthralled by the whole thing.
definitely. Like, if you were, coming of age in the 80s, it was impossible really to kind of miss the Spycatcher affair. I mean, it was just it was about as big a news story as you can get, and it involved, Margaret Thatcher herself, the Prime Minister, and her government taking them to court in Australia to stop, the dissemination of the book, due to, she said, sort of national security concerns about the information it contained, whereas in fact a lot of it had already come out. But it was just embarrassing to her government, and so they went for them in court and ended up suffering a rather humiliating loss in Australia. But it was very drawn out, and from talking to Paul about although he's very he puts a kind of a comic, slightly farcical gloss on it when talking about it. There's no mistaking that underneath it, he was at the time incredibly scared of, having, the British government essentially kind of come gunning for them, and got pretty kind of paranoid about whether he was being watched or followed, or what kind of file they were amassing against him. And I mean, it was definitely a pretty intense time with his CIA contact who had helped him, sort of telling him at one point, you need to be really careful, and him sort of, that was right before the court case started. So, there's no question that it kind of was a bit of a crash course, a baptism of fire along the lines now. I mean, we would sort of think about the WikiLeaks or sort of Snowden or so on, but in terms of just finding yourself at the middle of a kind of national security kind of maelstrom, and and it's hard not to flash forward to Bourne, but I mean, of course, it does, but it does, I think, gives you some of that asymmetry that you find in those Bourne movies between the sort of the military industrial complex and then a single individual. I mean, it wasn't just Paul on his own; it was him and Peter Wright and their lawyers, but nonetheless, it must have felt like a kind of David and Goliath type, contest.
I was going to say, it must have felt like being in the middle of a Paul Greengrass film.
Yeah, I think so. And I think he kind of later on, I mean, his suspicion was when he read Tony Gilroy's script for the Bourne Ultimatum, that one of the characters in that, who eventually becomes the Guardian reporter that we see, that's sort of being tailed, and then he's actually shot in the end in the movie, in the Waterloo sequence. As originally written, that character was a kind of much more kind of classic sort of paranoid journalist on, conducting a kind of All the President's Men style sort of paper trail hunt, with his room was plastered with clues, in that classic way they have in the movies where like the clues are all pasted up on the wall, and there's sort of like pins and bits of, and reading it, Paul felt, oh, this is actually a portrait of me in my spy catcher years, and that Gilroy was sort of, in a sense, kind of getting at him a little. They'd fallen out by this point, and that he was sort of including in the screenplay things that Paul had told him, about what it was like during that time when he was sort of literally twitching with the curtains and sort of wondering who was watching him. But I should say, by the way, that Paul, he's not a naturally conspiratorial or paranoid person. I mean, he sort of definitely came of age during that era of the great conspiracies and conspiracy theories, be it around kind of Kennedy or Watergate or what have you. And he kind of duly went down those rabbit holes as a student, as many of us still do, actually. But he did emerge out the other side, and he's not a sort of naturally paranoid or suspicious person, I should say. So that tells you too that like he really was going through it, if he was feeling that sort of during that time. But yeah, I mean, what a way to kind of cap your journalistic career, really. It's the ultimate outrage, the ultimate bit of, provocation.
And with real life consequences, because it was from that point that MI6 and MI5 were for the very first time recognized as existing officially.
That's right. They hadn't until that point been allowed to, you weren't allowed to say that they actually existed. And then they decided that it was part of, I think, of a long process that, which we now see today, actually, where they've really come quite far into the light. But yeah, they were in the shadows at that point, and the Spycatcher affair was one of the things that kind of pushed them out.
Nowadays, they can't. They have podcasts. They can't stop talking about themselves, writing memoirs, and.
That's right. I mean, they definitely are the recruitment drive. I think it's partly about, isn't it? They're kind of they're very overt about it. So yeah, you feel like you're always hearing about MI5, certainly. But I think MI6 too. There was a recent ad for recruits for that. Yeah, so it's definitely, they're not so secret anymore. Well, they are, but they're not so secretive.
After this, he was on to he wrote several novels and sort of he didn't immediately step into filmmaking, and so it's kind of this portrait of somebody who sort of almost backs into being a film director.
Well, he definitely wanted to be a film director, but I think
Right.
it took him a long time to kind of figure out what he could bring to it,
Right.
and he was making films in a much more conventional, classical way, by which I mean, they're with a very omniscient camera that sort of moves logically through a scene. And there's ways of editing a scene where you just sort of, cut from the sort of master to the reaction, to the headshot, to the reaction shot. There's a way of constructing a scene that is a kind of classical way of doing it, and he didn't want to do it like that. But it took him ages to figure out what he did want to do, or how he did want to shoot it. I think it was partly because, I mean, when he left journalism, I think he definitely left it behind, and had that was very much what he wanted. He felt like he'd kind of moved beyond it. But I think the clue was that he needed to take more of it with him, if you know what I mean. That actually the success came when he realized that actually those kind of old journalistic instincts, or rather, certainly the excitement, the adrenaline rush of being in the kind of Granada sort of editing bay when you're kind of editing live footage coming in. I mean, in this case, it would have been from like a football match, but nonetheless, you've got sort of live footage coming in from multiple cameras, and you're having to kind of cut that live, which is what they did, for it to kind of go out on national TV. And that kind of adrenaline rush, which I think he needed to kind of recreate that. And I definitely get that when you get to the Bourne movies and you see those CIA screens and everybody tracking Bourne on those screens, multiple feeds, multiple cameras, and it's where's Bourne? He's popped up in Malta, or, I very much get the excitement that he felt as a sort of TV journalist, when you're kind of having to edit Match of the Day live, basically. And so yeah, I think he needed to kind of leave journalism, but bring a lot of it with him, if that makes sense.
To go back and take some. I mean, the first film with which that breakthrough really takes place is Bloody Sunday, and I think also the element of, or is it? Am I jumping too far ahead?
Yeah, I mean, it's The Murder of Stephen Lawrence. Is where he really finds that, he really frees up the camera, shoots it documentary style. And there's a run that Stephen Lawrence, who's the black teenager that sort of was murdered, by thugs, but he doesn't know how badly wounded he is at one point at the very start of the film, and manages this thing, sort of incredible Olympian adrenalized run, even though he's mortally wounded, sort of down the street, and before finally kind of succumbing. And during that run, that was really the kind of breakthrough moment, because the camera is sort of chasing after him, pretty much just trying to keep up, and so that was kind of the film. He sort of discovered it, and then Bloody, I guess, because of its theatrical release, I think we could say that was the first, motion picture, where he sort of fully employs that kind of arsenal of techniques. And I mean, there are kind of great sequences in there where the cameraman just seems to be trying not to get hurt. Like
Right.
you're just running after these figures as they flee the bullets of the paras, and there is no concern for getting any kind of picture. I think the camera swings down and captures swinging ground and turf. Like that is not the cameraman is not trying to get any, he's getting anything at that point. He's just legging it, and it's a remarkable bit of footage. It wouldn't make anybody else's movie. Like they would just cut it, because it doesn't record anything except the ground swinging from side to side. But there it is in that one. It rightly, I think, got him a lot of attention. I think that, and I think the thing that he was at pains to tell me was that it was more than just a case of like just swinging the camera around. In other words, it wasn't you sort of took an otherwise orderly scene, but then just moved the camera a lot, and that was how you arrived at this. The essential thing was that he had to stage the scene firsthand, in a way, such a way that the chaos of it was actually the camera is not trying to be chaotic; it's actually trying to be clear. But the events have been staged in such a way that they've got their own momentum and their own kind of heat. And the camera and he would construct long, kind of sometimes 20-minute playlets almost, which could run. You would sort of press, you would say action, and then it would run for 20 minutes, almost like a play would. So he's not getting kind of coverage of this, that, or that shot. What's happening is that the cameraman in that situation is just trying to get a look in, and he's just trying to kind of cover it. So when he's swinging from head to head, it's not because he knows so and so is going to start speaking. I mean, he's just heard that so and so is speaking, and then swings around. So it's got a kind of the chaos, if you like, is there in the event and the action itself, not what the camera is doing. The camera's just trying to be as clear as possible, and so that was really the thing. It was the staging of the event that really was what was sort of new about it.
And behind that staging is the other side of the journalistic experience, which is a lot of research, a lot of talking to people, a lot of preparation, and also a journalistic sense of balance, that you're going to go and get stories from all sides, even though even though you're not necessarily, that's not necessarily going to lead to an equivalence. It might be that you'll end up being much more sympathetic to one side than the other, as indeed I think you are in Bloody Sunday. But you do recognise that there are no, even the baddies are human beings who are essentially making really bad mistakes.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he's very kind of pointed about the kind of communication breakdown and the sort of and the way it kind of sort of fans down, and the way that kind of something can start as a good intention and end up with bloodshed. I mean, he's very, very he's the absolute opposite of someone like Oliver Stone. Which is to say, he is not an incendiary. He's not politically incendiary, or he's not in the least bit sort of provocative politically. He's almost to a fault, very middle of the road and fair-minded, and wanting balance, and wanting, seeking consensus. He's a sort of natural consensus seeker. He's the guy in the middle trying to hold these sort of raging opposites together. And that kind of goes right to the heart of him. So although everything is, as you say, it's kind of got this, it's seeming chaos, but underneath it, he's almost painstakingly fair to the various sides in the conflict. And I think that's kind of, that's part of why it's so, I mean, it's a mixture of heat and coolness, isn't it? Like there's such kind of cool analysis of systemic breakdown in Bloody Sunday, while at the same time there's kind of such moral outrage and kind of what we're seeing, and it feels very raw and skinless, but at the same time very painstakingly laying out the kind of event cascade by which this kind of horror comes about, and the sort of tipping point at which events just have this momentum of their own and get out of control. And it's something that I think is really interesting to him, is that sort of moment at which that happens. But it's very fine. That's what I mean. There's something very almost not scientific, but just sort of, he's got a very good eye for when that point occurs. And it's very good cinematically and dramatically.
I think it also talks to the period we've all lived through, which is that period in which those very, if the East Berlin guards had started firing, or if the Tiananmen Square militia hadn't, we would live in very different worlds. And so, there are those fine decisions, and United 93 as well has that similar. There's what ifery, and there's a moment before history has happened where something else might happen, and yet you're dragged into the inevitability. But there's something about the human mind that I've watched how many performances of Hamlet, and every single time I watch it, I think this time he's gonna get it. He's gonna get out.
Right.
This time it's gonna be okay.
Well, there's something, definitely. I definitely see it as of our time, and that kind of asymmetry by which seemingly large and unopposable forces, in fact, incredibly right before our eyes, are actually. So that sort of tipping point at which the weight of the force that's being opposed, whether it's the British Army or the CIA, the that begins to tip. That's kind of it's very kind of the moment historically and sort of politically. Like, asymmetry is the defining thing about modern warfare and modern conflict. Whether it's Iraq or Gaza, it just always seems to. I think we've probably all said goodbye to the idea of kind of the equal and opposing forces on two sides of a battlefield. Like, it just seems again and again what we have is one huge force pummeling another much smaller one, and the dynamics by which the smaller one turns the tables is what fascinates Paul Greengrass, I think, and it's kind of what lies at the sort of the roots of those films, and it goes hand in hand, I think, with his kind of old socialist instincts, which is to say, like, when have the people had enough? When does a revolution happen? And United 93 too is a sort of you're seeing a revolution essentially of sorts on that plane.
I always had one question about United 93, and I was kind of hoping you'd ask it, but it's a very detailed question, so there's no reason you would necessarily ask it.
Yeah,
but, there's the one like member of the sort of passengers who says no, we shouldn't. It would be dangerous if we try to fight back. We should listen to them, and we should is German. And I always sort of think, is that. I think at the time as well, there was a sort of there was a little bit of criticism about that character, because there was a sense that, during this period in which French fries were freedom fries, it felt like a sort of sop to Europe, the anti-European element of American foreign policy. I don't know if that was I can't imagine that he would necessarily purposefully do it.
I mean, as I remember, I think the family of that particular passenger pushed back on that. They didn't like that was the portrayal, but I also believe, I think I'm right in saying that it was based on something, that it wasn't just something made up. Right. That was the argument being advanced by him. I could have that wrong, but I do remember that it definitely ruffled a few feathers. But yeah, I don't think he was mean. I don't think he would have intended it as anything, as representative of anything larger. But I do think that it is a point of view that needed to be dramatized, because you needed to reach that point where, I mean, the decision essentially to attack was, which is quite an incredible one. You're going to attack the people flying the plane. It seems so counterintuitive and self-destructive, that I think you had to show somebody being legitimately scared about what was going to, the consequences of it. So I don't know if I completely can answer it, but I do think, there was some controversy over the portrayal anyway, even, as I say, it was rooted in something. But yeah, he's very kind of, they spoke to the families. He always kind of tries as much as possible to bring them on side, as it were, and to hear them out. and it's kind of remarkable. I mean, he doesn't sort of just get in there, and he's not a typical filmmaker in the sense of getting in there and kind of lousing up their story and then getting out. You know, like he really does suffer, I think, from conscience about like kind of how it was going to be received. And he was always telling me how nervous he was, you know, when he first showed the Stephen Lawrence film Bloody Sunday, 93, to the constituent audiences of those who, you know, with loved ones in the film, and you know how it was. And at that point, I think, you know, one's kind of filmmaker cojones kind of go out the window. I think you're, you know, like, you know, you really are just sort of very, very keen that you're not going to be upset and causing them any more kind of pain than in fact the reconstruction is going away. But yeah, he seems abnormally keyed into getting it right for them.
I recently was in Oslo and we walked past where Breivik blew up the part of the Parliament building, and it's still being rebuilt. Actually, many years on, it's still in the process of renovation. And I was really interested to talk to some Norwegians, and they were telling me that people who were on that island, kids who were on that island, there are now a number of them. I think it's like 6 or 7 who are actually in the government. So they've not only kind of, you know, I mean, this camp was for the sort of Labour Party of Norway, and it was supposed to be for like potentially the next generation of leaders. But Breivik's act, as horrific and horrible as it was, you know, didn't turn the survivors away from their politics and their duty,
right.
but you know, and I think that's a wonderful thing about that film, that it is such it's not a reconstruction of the horrors. I think that's what I was expecting when I first saw it in Venice, was, oh, this is going to be one of those sort of grueling reconstructions and we're going to have to see all the horror. And it was actually, no, the horror's a very small part of the film, and really it's about the survivors.
Yeah, it's fun. It's like, I definitely watched it through my kind of finger, you know, and just because of, I think the first time viewer of that film brings a lot to it, and it's as scary as you want it to be. And I remember being pretty scared of it and watching it through, you know, through my hands, and it was it gave me a little jolt of trauma. You definitely get a little taste of like kind of the shock and the trauma of it. You know, when I came back to it several years later, certainly for the purposes of the book, I was kind of I knew essentially what I was dealing with, and you were watching it with a slightly more kind of forensic kind of eye. And I sort of, yes, like you're like, oh, I see. Yes, we don't really see that much, but it's definitely, there's, you know, such as the kind of the approach and the sort of sobriety of the filmmaking, that it kind of conveys it brings its own kind of gravity to it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And it just, and I think too, the emphasis on the sort of the lasting kind of psychological and emotional wounds, again, I kind of feel like that's partly his thing. You know, like the violence in his movies is really never that protracted. You know, there's never that much of it. Like he said to me once that, you know, like violence, the weird thing about violence is it's over really fast. Like you see any kind of particular explosion of violence, the actual explosion takes however long, but it's in your memory, it's sort of way, way longer. It becomes this sort of huge echoing event, you know, and I think that's kind of what his films are about. It's about the echo rather than the kind of the explosive event. Because you look at them and you're like, oh yeah, you don't see that much, but you feel like you do. So I think it's he's definitely, I think, a kind of filmmaker of trauma. I think that's one way of putting it. Like I think he's just he's really attuned to the sort of tremors on the track that precede violence, and then the aftershocks, after it's kind of passed, and that structure, is the sort of almost life cycle, if you like, of like a violent act, whether it's an act of political violence or not. You often see him sort of tracking that, tremors, build, explosive act over very quickly, and then sort of aftershock, and then that's the shape of the film.
Mm.
But you even see that in the new one, about the wildfire, the lost bus. It's that same life cycle. He's definitely really attuned to that slightly, or it's almost organic. There's a sort of just organic this thing. Like violence has a life the same way that organic life, or organisms have a life. It sort of begins and it ends. It swells and then it kind of fades, and it's like. And that's what he sort of seems to be tuned into.
I think one of the great examples of what you're talking about as well is Captain Phillips, and that amazing moment at the end of the film where Tom Hanks, in one of his best sort of moments of acting, I feel, sort of just acts traumatic exhaustion and an episode of complete breakdown. And it just... And I mean, I know there's a sort of like, oh, there's your Oscars clip sort of shorthand for that, but it really absolutely overcomes that sort of triteness. It's a genuine. You genuinely don't think, oh, here I am watching Tom Hanks cry. You're thinking, oh my God, here I'm seeing a human being collapse.
Right. I mean, the way they came about the scene, I think, tells you that they. Because it wasn't working for a while. He was supposed to kind of break down on the phone, talking to his wife, and which is, if you like, a kind of more trite sort of Hollywood way of doing it, but it just wasn't working, and so they were just casting about how to figure out how to shoot this scene. They knew that he ought to be shown breaking down in some way. So they just asked the captain of the ship that they were using to film on, where would it have been taken when he first got on the boat? And they said it would be down in the medic bay. So they just shot down to the medic bay, told the medics there, real medics, that, they were going to be joined Tom Hanks, and then started filming. And then Tom Hanks comes in and the medics fluffed it the first time, and then they got it the second. But the way that kind of evolved, and particularly, I think, too, the thing that triggers the emotion of the scene is the kindness of the medic towards Phillips at that point. Because as a viewer, it's probably it's the first kind thing that's happened to him in the entire film. And his system, as is so often the case, you can kind of keep up the front, you can keep everything together all the time that you're being attacked. Have to, but the moment somebody shows you an act of kindness, fold. And I think that medic's very, very straightforward. You're okay. Everything's going to be fine. Like, it's kind of what triggers the welling of the emotion in Hanks, and it's just such a lovely moment. I mean, it's amazing bit of acting, as you say, and they had him sort of wired up to like various sort of monitors, for his heart and breathing and whatnot, and afterwards, they were just saying that's about as close a physiological recreation of kind of shock and trauma as you're likely to see. Like, even the medics were convinced,
the heart rate and everything was going like the way
that's right.
that somebody would
like,
be.
Hanks is kind of literally, his body is experiencing something. It's something I wish I would one day be able to ask him about, because Hanks is really good at this stuff, and he's really good at it. There's a moment in Private Ryan too where Miller, his character, where tears steal over him suddenly. I think it's after they've gone after the sniper's nest, and what he does is he feels it coming on, and he starts looking over his shoulder because he doesn't want any of his men to see him. And then when he realizes that none of his men are nearby, then he lets himself give into these sort of shakes and sobs. And then he kind of wipes himself down, and then off he goes. And I remember when I saw that in Saving Private Ryan, I was thinking, God, that's so good. Like, he knows it's coming, and he's trying to kind of hide it from his men. It's almost like a physical reaction that he can't quite stop. But his mind is, he's trying to still manage the landing, if you like. Do you know what I mean? And he's trying to kind of shield it from his men. And I was so fascinated by that, like, that he would understand that the reaction at that point is his body, not necessarily, because an actor, you'd think that maybe they lead with their emotion all the time, right? But Hanks in that moment is not being governed by his emotions. Miller's trying to hide them. And anyway, so he's somehow got this amazing instinct for like how sort of traumatic reactions catch up with us. Just as and at the end of Captain Phillips is, if you like, the kind of that to the nth degree. Like I think he sort of takes that moment in Ryan and really now delivers on, it's a much more, it's even more visceral and real, a raw sort of take on exactly that. Like his there is Hanks just saying, I think, he's completely detached. His mind, his mouth is sort of chittering on about this, that, and the other, but his body has something in store for him. It's all about to catch up with him, and it's triggered by that medic, and it's like what he seems to just get is that complete disconnect that people have when they're in shock. I just don't know where he gets it. Like, where has he observed that? That's my question to Hanks. Like, where has he seen that? Why is he so good on that? Nothing in Hanks's background says that, like, I mean, he hasn't fought in a war. He hasn't sort of, as far as I know, had any kind of violence in his upbringing or kind of. So why is he so good at that? It's amazing to me.
It's like the old acting lesson of how to play a drunk man. Play somebody trying to look sober. Nobody. A drunk man is somebody acting sober. It's not somebody acting drunk, because that's the last thing you want to be seen as.
That's really good. That's a really good point. Definitely, it's just sort of, I guess, in the sense, is acting 101, if you can remember it. Like we spend more time suppressing emotion than actually showing it, and it really kind of keys into that.
There are two big questions I wanted to ask you, and I know we're running short on time, but I'd really love to get your takes on this. One is one of the delights of the book, of which there are many, because I think you always pack your books with so much more than just. I want to say just a film book, but obviously a film book has. I'm writers on film. We love film books, but so there was this question I had that was Paul as a subject is someone who's really candid with you about his films, and so there are quite a few of his films that he kind of gives a kicking to. There are some of his films I think, I haven't seen that, and then I read the bit where he talks about it. It goes, and I don't need to. I don't think I need to see that particular one, the Kenneth Branagh and Helena Bonham Carter film. He's similarly quite critical of Green Zone, but at the same time, he sort of knows where it went wrong, but at the same time, still thinks there's quite a good film, at least an hour of a good film in there. And I loved what he said about Jason Bourne, because I remember he absolutely pinpoints the moment that I thought, oh, this is not going to be good, which unfortunately is right at the very beginning, where he's bare knuckle boxing, and you just think, oh, that's such a movie thing. Nobody ever made money doing that, and instead he had an alternative scene where he was going to be like on an oil rig, and there's an immigration raid or something, and he's that's going to dislodge him from wherever he is. And I just thought, wow, this guy really has a very clear idea of things, and I think a lot of directors do. I think if you get them away from their publicists, they will be quite open and candid with you, and they will be very good viewers and critics of their own films. But you have to get them away from their publicists. So I just wanted to ask you about that. Getting that, what did you think of Paul's reading of those films? And
I mean, he was definitely visibly and palpably pained when discussing the films that he wasn't happy with. Unusually candid, I would say, and maybe to a fault in a way. Like the Helena Bonham Carter thing isn't particularly good, but it's almost become a comic shtick for him, is how much he's willing to bash it, Right. And I think some of his recovery consists, if you like, of the exorcism of the event just comes out in just sort of a willingness, at least, to get points for kind of, throwing himself under the bus if he feels he's, done something foolish. Like he's a sort of team play. He's a team player. He likes a good ribbing. He likes to, administer one. Like there's a sort of, he's got a sense of humor about himself. And I think kind of pasting your own movie, as he does in that case, is sort of, he gets a certain enjoyment from it. I would say that with Green Zone, it's very different. I'd say that he's still pained because I think, he feels responsible, and because he takes seriously the trust that is shown him by and was shown him by Universal, and the money involved. I think kind of and nobody's complaining about Jason Bourne because, of course, it made a lot of money. But I think that with Green Zone, he definitely felt that, and he responded with a kind of several, well, I would say years. He says months, but I mean, he really, really took it very seriously and set about anatomizing what had gone wrong on his part. I got less of a sense of what others had done, but I definitely got a sense from him of what he thought he had done wrong. But in order that it doesn't happen again, he's just trying to immunize himself. And, he was essentially right that a lot of it was finding a production partner that he could trust that would tell him the honest truth about what certain things are going to cost and so on. I think he was ill served, on Green Zone by some of his production partners who were kind of gabbling kind of figures that seemed plucked from thin air. And he was trying to say, no, 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 what is this going to cost? And he was not getting the right answers. Because every film since then has been absolutely, tight as a whip. Like there's the really very, if you want to see kind of good production, what a producer does too, sort of look at his films subsequently and the way they've sort of come in on schedule and budget and and their artistic sort of successes too. It goes sort of hand in hand. It's not just that he kind of didn't waste money. It's just that they're sort of punching their weight. You know what I mean?
The Clint Eastwood method.
Yeah.
On time, on budget, under budget, and you have your freedom.
That's right. You have freedom, and it gives you a kind of balance. Those films just have sort of balance. They're not off balance. They're not kind of being dragged down. They're not getting sort of sucked into the big kind of black holes that can, suck up money on a movie production. So, I would say that he just took the and it's always relative too. I mean, who knows whether Green Zone it may even have made money by this point. You see it regularly on Netflix. It's streaming here, there, and everywhere. Some of the things that get held up as sort of failed films, often over time end up making their money back. But certainly nobody got rich off of Green Zone. But he took it seriously and worked out how can I avoid that, because it must be the worst. I think it was one of the worst feelings in the world. Definitely don't want to go through that again. How do I not go through that again?
I always think it must be really weird as well when you still have to press tour a bad film. You still have to go out and do a Q&A and you know what I mean. It must be there comes a point where you're just like, can we just all go home now?
Yeah, definitely. Exactly. I mean, he's sort of. I don't remember how much of a thing they did for that, but and I should say too, there's things that are like, particularly in the sort of first half, and you just sort of wish it were better in its second half. Yeah, I think it's he's very I mean, I would say that like one of the striking things about him as an interviewee, as a subject, was that he's amazingly honest. I would say, and to the extent that. Normally, this is a kind of single source book in the same way that the Nolan book was a single source book, i.e., the rules were that I would just speak to them and them alone, which means it never really gets into the kind of the Peter Biskin sort of model, if you like, which is like every last thing that went wrong on a film production. You get to hear about the gossip and the dish and like. That is off the table, right? You're just talking to the director. But what was unusual about Paul was because he was so, I felt unusually honest about, and we would kind of go over films again and again and again, go on movies times, multiple passes. So I got to see where his, everything was kind of lining up and consistent, you know what I mean? And his answers remained consistent. So that tells you he's being straight up with you. Is that even though it was a single source book, he allowed me, because of his candor, more of a kind of 360-degree view of the production. In other words, I got to see what was going on in the production much more than I did with sort of Nolan or with some of the other subjects I've written about, where you've really just got a very narrow view of what of just there. With Paul, I really did feel, for instance, that I was able to get to the bottom of the Tony Gilroy kind of falling out in a way because I felt like he was being, he was essentially being honest about what Paul, what his side of it was, and he was being it enabled me to see that argument, I think, from both their points of view, which isn't something you'd necessarily expect. You'd normally expect it to be so slanted, and the person you'd fallen out with, Gilroy, do you know what I mean? That it would just be just Paul's side of the story. Now, there's definitely that's definitely still the case to some extent, but I really felt like I was able to get Gilroy's contribution to those films really in as well.
Did you ever feel like you had to give Gilroy the right of reply there with that, just with that material, just because it was a falling out?
Well, it certainly not, ethically, but just from my own curiosity. Yes, right. I mean, I would love to know, what his response is and whether I got it right. Basically whether he, we managed to get it accurate. But I certainly didn't want to break the rules of the book because, I mean, I'd said one thing and you can't then kind of go around somebody and then change the rules. But it definitely got difficult in the sense that I was trying to make sure that that if he were to read it, he wouldn't just be kind of hurling it across the room. Because I do think that Gilroy's contribution to those films is immense, and I think Paul knows that too, right? I don't think it's sort of, and I think he said so. So I was definitely at pains to make sure that the reader would know exactly what Gilroy brings to it, which is, the fundamental, the asymmetry that I was talking about, that, where the excitement comes from seeing one man outwit a vast system. That's Gilroy. So it's really a kind of case of, like, I think I say this in the book, like everybody was an author of Bourne, like Gilroy saw something of himself in Bourne, and I think Paul saw something of himself in Bourne, and I think Matt Damon saw something of himself in Bourne, and you had these sort of three authors, converging, and it's sort of like a tripod, and it's like for some reason that seems such a recipe for like great movie making. Not that it needs to be a man. I think it can be a woman equally, obviously, in character, but it sort of seems to have happened just because of the nature of film history. It seems to happen more with kind of these male, the protagonists are mostly. So I think of, Benjamin Braddock in The Graduate, same three-way thing of screenwriter, director, and actor, all of them thinking, oh my God, I'm Benjamin. And the same with Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver. You've got the screenwriter, director, and actor, all of them saying, I'm Travis Bickle. And then you have, and then you have the same with Bourne. Like all of them are sort of midwifing him, and I think that's a particularly exciting chemistry at the movies. And I think it certainly results in really great characters.
Well, this brings me on to my final question, really, which is the second question I referred to earlier, which is one of the other things that's incredibly enlightening, and it comes from the candidness of the interviews, is just what a complete shit show the Bourne films were in the making of, and how they kind of get, and then when sort of Green Zone sort of runs out of control, you to some degree you sort of think, well, this was in the post. This is not, this is not out of the blue or some necessarily hubristic thing. It's something that could have happened on either of the two Bourne films going into this. True. And you looked out twice, and the third time you got caught, really. But kind of pulling those films together out of rewriting them as they go. The editor is crucially important. I think, is it Chris Rouse is the editor?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
They've got a storyboard artist who is pulling things together so they can visualize shots better, and the different sort of copies of the script. I mean, good films should not be made like this. And if bad films,
No.
if this is a biography of a bad filmmaker, you would be going, well, obviously he's going to make bad films. Look at how
Sure.
hodgepodge it is, and yet he kind of does bring it all together somehow.
Oh God. I mean, it was because Paul, as I say, has got a very kind of, he's actually got a very kind of organized head, and he's very systematic about things. It took me a while actually to realize just how crazy those films had been, Supremacy and Ultimatum, and just how much they really were just pulling it out of thin air, and each morning. And they had two shooting scripts. They had two rival versions of the action they were supposed to be shooting. There was the script that Tony Gilroy had done and kind of wouldn't change, and then there was the one that Paul had commissioned, that Matt Damon was on board with, but they did not succeed in supplanting Gilroy's original script, and so it was up to the producer Frank Marshall to every night forge some few inches they could move forward the next day from these sort of competing drafts, and hammer out a kind of compromise between the two camps. And of course, sometimes they ran out of runway, and they would not have the material to shoot, and they would be forced to think it up on the day, which is the last place you ever want to be, with a movie of that size and budget. And I mean, it is astonishing that they're as good as they are, but I do think that the act of pulling it out of their arses, to use an expression, isn't in some way in the film, because that's essentially what Bourne is doing all the time, is improvising in the moment to avoid disaster. And their act of kind of collective improvisation, Damon and Frank Marshall and Paul Greengrass, didn't in some way infuse its way into the electricity of Bourne himself, as he's, making up stuff as he goes along, using the walkie-talkie of the guy he's just defeated to kind of listen in on their conversation and stay one ahead of the action. I mean, it definitely was a movie or a series of movies where the making of it, the chaotic making of it, sort of is almost the main narrative of the actual resulting film, and so there's sort of, I don't know, it is an amazing, it definitely is a remarkable thing, and I think a lot of it, where I think Paul deserves a lot of credit, is for his ability to stand in the middle of just this extraordinary, roiling, chaotic kind of sort of situation. It's like in the middle of a battlefield, and essentially just finding a scene, a way forward, a case to prosecute, and just moving forward, persuading, keeping up this kind of constant advocacy, patiently, for the movie that he wanted to make, not losing his cool. He's very even tempered, which I think is kind of maybe part of the key to a lot of this. He's quite sort of very mild mannered in some ways, and just patiently prosecuting and not upsetting the table and not walking off, not kind of manipulating or trying to play games, and so I think somehow that just knits it all together in the final analysis, and he definitely, of all the films that are in the book, I would say that the Bourne Supremacy is the one where the kind of the mystery and the sort of the marvel of movie making is kind of most in the making of that film. You could really kind of read about the making of that film and just kind of, I still don't fully understand how they ended up with the film they did. And And I think that is, I could almost be reading about it forever, trying to figure out, oh yeah, why, how they did pull it off. Because as you say, like there are 1,000 universes in which it's just not a good film, and it's sort of easy to spot why. But there's something about, so that tells you there's some lesson in there if we can only find it. But it is rather remarkable.
It's amazing. It's amazing, and it's an amazing book for those reasons. It makes for a great read. That's the thing, you know. If he was a director who just sort of like storyboarded everything and everything was perfect, and it would be such a boring book. You would have to, you know. Thank God for chaotic filmmakers who, or at least production processes.
Yeah, I mean, he's just got a very, very high tolerance for chaotic situations, I would say. Situations that would panic a lesser mortal and have me running for cover. He just does not panic in those situations and is quite cool and firm, but he's not inflamed. And I think that kind of is what sort of marks him out, really. The ability to kind of keep his own emotions in check. I mean, not all the time. I think there's a couple of incidents which he was happy to tell me about where he kind of lost his shit and kind of was shouting at somebody, but he's not a shouter. And those incidents are notable because they're so rare. And so, yeah, he's there was something. He's just sort of calmly prosecuting it from the center of the boat. But he just has, does have this extraordinary ability to withstand all this pressure around him, which is kind of maybe his superpower, I think.
Yeah. So, Tom, listen, do you have any? Can you tell us who's next or what next in terms of your next project?
I do have a couple of sort of leads, but I'm not quite at the point of deciding which is the one I'm going for and which direction. And in fact, I'm sort of, a little bit playing on a runway, trying to work out which runway to take. But it definitely, I feel like in some ways I'm getting to the end of the filmmaker, the directors, and that are interesting to me anyway. That like have done what I was talking about. They've gone into the belly of the beast and they've come back with great films. Like that. Like it's. I'm not exactly sure, but I'll let you know what the next project's going to be. But I feel like I've sort of done my bit for certainly for the kind of Brits that have kind of gone abroad and kind of conquered the dragon, or ridden the dragon. And, and I feel like Paul is sort of certainly of all of them, maybe the most underrated in the sense that he doesn't quite get the devoted fan following that someone like Nolan gets.
Yeah, it's not a film bro sort of director, even though that idea of the film bro is, I'm not sure. I think it must be American or something. I've not quite understood the idea.
No, it's definitely, there's sort of less,
don't make people feel bad for liking stuff.
No, exactly. But it's like, so he's sort of, but yeah, he's quite, as I say, he's quite sort of down to earth and quite unpretentious. And there's, he's, and easy to talk to, and there's less kind of mystique maybe because someone like kind of Nolan definitely keeps back. I mean, so does Paul. I mean, he's not exactly he's still a kind of very private person. I mean, it's the only book he's done. It's not like he sort of loves talking to the press, but I mean, when you do meet him, he's very kind of open and approachable.
Gotcha.
And so yeah, I was pleased to do the book because I really felt like, to do the films that he's made, to earn over $1 billion at the box office as those movies have, as all of his movies together have, and to do that with your kind of liberal credentials intact and to have made sort of intelligent, kind of informed movies that are both incredibly exciting mainstream thrillers to watch, but also feel like they are, open to what's going on in the world, journalistically open to what's going on in the world, and sort of attuned to the world that we live in a way that obviously Michael Bay movies are not, or that, and don't even claim to be. I thought that was kind of pretty incredible, so it's definitely an achievement kind of worth sort of trumpeting about.
Definitely.
And,
Definitely. And you trumpet so well.
Well, I definitely, it's always good to follow your enthusiasms, as you know, right? You just
Exactly.
kind of, you can't go far wrong.
Listen, I can't wait to read your next project, but you have a well-deserved rest as
Yeah,
well.
exactly.
Because it's I know how hard these books are, and the depth of that you go into is amazing. So thanks so much, Tom, for the book and the conversation.
Totally. Always a pleasure, John. Thank you.